Okay, so now we move on to the last step of silicon-based solar cell manufacturing. This step is known as co-firing. The co-firing basically means that you take the entire structure, the entire wafer, along with the contact pads and passivation layer, whatever you have, you place everything inside a furnace for a very short duration, just a few seconds. And how do you do that? You take a conveyor belt type furnace. These furnaces are also called conveyor furnaces, belt furnaces, and so on. When there is a heated chamber, but the sample is placed on a belt, it goes inside and then comes out on the other side. So that's how it stays only for a very short duration inside the heated chamber. So we need to do that. Why? Because if you remember, we have two things. We have a passivation layer, and on top of that we now formed our silver electrodes. Now silver electrodes need to contact the N layer, right? They need to make an electrical contact with the N layer, and now we have this silicon nitride layer in between. So what we actually need is, we somehow need to selectively remove the nitride right below your electrode, such that the electrode material, the silver, can touch the N layer. So how can you do that? This cannot be done just by heat treatment or something, because then you will damage the entire structure. Anyway, silicon nitride has like really high melting point, 1900, something like that. So that cannot be done. Only way to do is this is via certain chemical process. So we need to have a chemical which can react with the silicon nitride such that just over there this material is dissolved or etched away, or it forms another chemical. So for this purpose, what actually happens is you mix something known as glass fritz in your silver ink. So silver ink, I had mentioned this in the previous lecture also, silver inks contain some additive, something which is in addition to the silver. So there is one additive, glass fritz, and then you also have the organic binder. Now these glass fritz contain what is known as lead oxide. At least the initial ones or the previous ones. Nowadays there is a lot of effort on making lead-free silver inks, but still in the industrial processes what is used contains lead oxide in it. So what happens when you heat? So as I have mentioned here, the temperature of this furnace is between 750 to 850, 870, something like that. Not very high temperatures, and the duration is very short. It's typically 5 to 10 seconds. At the most it is 20 seconds. Okay. So now whatever reaction takes place, this is very well known fact that when we pass the sample through this inline furnace, conveyor furnace, then the silver electrodes, like what is shown in the second image here. So the first one is before firing and after firing. So this does take place, and the contacts, silver contacts, are formed. However, the mechanism of this process, that has been debated for a very long time. So there are two mechanisms or two reactions that are more commonly accepted. So the first step that is taking place is that whatever is your nitride, that is etched between 500 and 650 degrees centigrade by the lead oxide. Now once this material is etched, the silicon nitride is etched, then your silicon surface is exposed. Okay, so that is the step number 1. What happens after that? Now when we further increase the temperature, there are silver ions formed that dissolve into the molten glass. So now you also have some molten glass there, because the glass, the beads or the frits have melted. Plus you will see in a minute that there will also be some silicon oxide formed, which is also basically nothing but glass. So now the silver ions get dissolved into this molten glass, and in the next step, in the following step, the silver metal is precipitated. So this silver metal actually forms the contact, and so you have this entire contact of silver. Okay, so the chemical reactions that take place, the first reaction is shown here. This lead oxide is reacting with the silver nitride, and then it is forming some sort of lead, metallic lead, plus some silicon oxide, and there is some nitrogen being released. Then another possible mechanism, as I mentioned before, that this mechanism was debated. So there is also a possibility that if there is no lead, then this is the reaction that is taking place. It's just the formation of silicon oxide, and metallic silicon is precipitating directly. But we need to also kind of notice that this is the temperature at which this reaction is taking place. Is it enough to etch away the nitride layer without the lead? So anyway, these are the two possible reactions that take place. Either way, you have this molten glass that will serve as the carrier for your silver metal. There is also one belief that there is some sort of temporary intermediate alloy formed between the alloy of silver and lead that is formed, and then from there the silver metal precipitates out. In any case, there is metallic silver precipitating, and that is the silicon nitride layer is being etched away, and this silver is now touching your silicon substrate. So this is the co-firing step, and that is how you get the metal contacts established. Now, one more thing that this co-firing does is that it reduces the film stress. So I had mentioned that whenever you're printing something, especially thin structures, thin films and so on, and then it dries up, then your film will have certain stresses because the solvent is evaporating, right? So once you heat it rapidly and cool it, which is what happens in the co-firing step, then this heating and cooling process will remove this residual stress to a great extent. So that is another advantage of this process. And finally, one more thing that we need to remember is what happens to the aluminum, because you remember that we now place the entire wafer inside the furnace. On the back side, what we had was aluminum coating. Aluminum actually has a very low melting point compared to other metals. It's up somewhere around 600 degrees. So what happens to that? It turns out that this aluminum layer actually forms a temporary alloy, again intermediate alloy with the silicon. So you have this aluminum silicon alloy, which as the material cools, once the wafer is out of the furnace, once it cools, then this recrystallizes to again form an aluminum rich layer which is conductive. So this is what then we use as electrodes. Now on this slide I have also mentioned one reference that you can read, which will tell you more about the details of the mechanisms and different possibilities of this solar cell co-firing. So with this lecture, now we are pretty much done with different steps of solar cell manufacturing. In the next lecture, I'm going to discuss the parameters that we need to optimize for a solar cell. Okay.